There's a lot of talk about the cost of college now, about college debt, which has reached $1.6 trillion. A lot of concern about whether people can continuously afford higher ed. And there is a dropping trust in higher education. According to the Gallup poll released last year, Americans lost more faith in higher ed than in any other institution. The rate of dropping was greater in higher ed, 9%, and we're now below 50%. Still above Congress and the president and the courts, behind police and the military. So we really want to have a conversation here today about the cost of higher ed, but also about the value of higher ed. Often what's missing from that conversation is this question of what do you get for the cost, right? And when we think about buying a car, you think not just about how much it costs, but what you're getting, gas mileage, safety, the driving experience. And also we want to talk a little bit about the public value of higher ed, because higher ed, of course, is not just valuable to individuals, but also valuable to the public at large. And it's not just paid for by individuals, but is paid for by taxpayers. So we've got a terrific panel here today. To my right is Janet Napolitano, president of the University of California System, and of course, Secretary of Homeland Security and Governor of the state of Arizona. Welcome. Next to her is my friend Angel Cabrera, who is currently the president of George Mason University, a large Research One university in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Angel, it was just announced within the last couple of weeks, will September 1st become the president of Georgia Tech. Welcome, Angel.
Thank you.
And then last but certainly not least, my friend Juan Salgado. Juan is the president, the CEO of the chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago, a multi-campus community college system in Chicago. And Juan has spent 20 years working hard trying to enable social mobility for lower income individuals in the Chicago region and people of color through his work with Instituto, which was a nationally recognized workforce development entity. So welcome, Juan. Thank you. So let's get started with this question of trust in higher education. Why is it, in your view, that Americans are losing faith in higher ed? Before we get to the question of cost and value, I think it's might be helpful to hear a little bit about that. Janet, thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I have a lot of speculation about that. But first of all, the label higher ed covers a multitude of different kinds of institutions, from public research institutions like the University of California to for-profit diploma mills where students typically don't graduate and come out with a lot of debt. And so you have this wide variety. We do, I think, live in an era of skepticism of all institutions, and higher education is not immune from that. I think the question of value gets lost. So there's no kind of national coordinating strategy on communications for higher ed to be out there basically putting out the value proposition. And so you get constantly hit with cost and debt, and we see this in the Democratic Party right now during the campaign season. But what the public is not getting is value. What is the value to an individual from getting that diploma? And then finally, there's that age-old trope that colleges and universities are liberal bastions, and they are brainwashing our young people. I don't think it's true, and B, it kind of underestimates young people and their ability to think for themselves. But nonetheless, that's out there, and that message, of course, gets reinforced from the White House, which doesn't help.
Thanks. So what about this on health? There's this notion that with decentralization of higher ed, we really have chosen this decentralized model. And I think inherent in what you said, Janet, was this notion that there is no single entity. You don't have the government that can say, here's the value of higher ed, and yet the government has some responsibility for the cost. Is it that? Is it politics? What's going on?
Well, when you look, I mean, the Gallup has data that you mentioned is very telling. Pew Research has also run a lot of data, and there tend to be three reasons why people have questions about what's going on in colleges, universities. One is the cost piece, and the fact that student debt is now 1.6 trillion and growing. It's the largest category of family debt after mortgage. I mean, it's bigger than anything else. And that's a real reason to be concerned. And the even intergenerational implications of putting that burden of debt on students and their families, that's a real issue. The second reason for this skepticism, according to the Pew data, is a sense that maybe what we teach in colleges doesn't match what employers need. Honestly, the data, in my view, doesn't support that source of concern. If you look at employment data, right now what employers are telling us is we're not producing graduates fast enough. And the rates of unemployment of people with college degrees are far below what you find in individuals who don't complete a college degree and so on. So that one is a little bit puzzling given sort of the data out there. The third one, as Janet mentioned, is the political piece. And I do think there is some reason to be concerned. And the political piece is not just universities tend to lean left and dominant ideologies on college campuses tend to lean left, which, by the way, there is data showing that, yeah, that's pretty accurate. In my own institution, some of my biggest crises in my 7 years at the helm of George Mason have to do with either accepting donations from conservative-leaning donors or recruiting faculty from conservative-leaning ideologies. So I have been at the forefront of that, and there is some truth to that criticism. But it's not just whether colleges lean left or right, but it's also the sense that we are overprotective of our students, that we're not doing enough to exposing students to a variety of ideas. I think there is a classic quote by one of Janet's predecessors that the role of universities should not be to make ideas safe for students, but students be strong enough to deal with all sorts of ideas. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that sense.
Thanks. So Juan, when you look beneath the data, as Janet mentioned, higher ed is lots of kinds of institutions. Community colleges are, in fact, the one group that is increasing in trust or staying steady, all the polls show. So say a little bit about that and why that might be, but also your perceptions about trust in higher ed as a general matter.
Absolutely. So I look at it from a frame of rising inequality. And, education is supposed to be the great equalizer. It's supposed to be that tool that allows anybody from any part of society to move up economically. And to the degree that the populace sees higher education no longer as part of a system that helps to equalize the equation, right? To help folks from the lowest income communities and quintiles to actually rise, then we're going to continue to have this challenge. When you think about community colleges, we are in every community, rural and urban. And by and large, our students are the lowest income students in higher education. They're also, we have the highest numbers of students that are first generation college goers, right? And we serve a broader need of, in terms of employment opportunities. So a plethora of career pathways that are available. And so proximity matters, right? Community colleges are institutions that you can touch and feel, you can access. They're yours, right? They're yours. And you know that they have helped generations of people in your community, right? Albeit we've got a long way to go on quality and relevance, okay? We have to admit that as community college. However, in terms of being present for those communities, right? And increasingly what you're seeing is middle class communities accessing community colleges because they're beginning to realize that the cost benefit equation of going on in that 4-year and taking out that mortgage, is not so beneficial, right? And so I think we've got to change the mindset. We can't be, higher ed can no longer be elitist institutions. To the degree we can change that, I think we could change the narrative.
So it's interesting. I mean, you talk a little bit about how the value of higher ed is starting to be considered by individuals, and yet the national conversation is really about cost. So why aren't any of the candidates talking about the value of higher ed? Angel, what you cited as the need for more people in particular fields, especially where we're underproducing the number of higher ed degrees. Juan, in your view, why is it that we're not having the conversation about value that you're seeing families starting to have?
Well, from my perspective, it's a question of who's the messenger, okay? So I think what we've tried to do at our community college system is turn our employers into the messenger, okay? Turn our 4-year universities into the messenger. More and more, our 4-year universities are taking on community college students as part of an integral strategy. In fact, we just signed a year ago a guaranteed admissions agreement with the University of Illinois system. Now, many states have these kinds of agreements. We didn't have this in place, right? And so you can go to the U of I, on a guaranteed basis by coming through us and having the U of I promote that, having the U of I go out, having our employer partners talk about the value of a city college's credential and the value of an education. That gets back to families and students. And Dr. Janice Jackson's here, who's the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, having principals and teachers, right, promote the full plethora of options that are available to students, 4-year, 2-year. I think higher ed needs to create voices that are not ourselves in order to be effective.
Angel?
Well, it's fascinating to me when people start questioning whether even a college degree is necessary anymore. One of my colleagues, Brian Kaplan, an economist, actually has written a very interesting, he's a professor, he's like lived in higher ed all of his life, and he's writing very interesting arguments about why we don't need universities. Kind of puzzling, but what's very interesting is most of the arguments about we don't need everybody to get a college degree, higher ed may be overrated, there are many other ways to be successful. They come from people with advanced degrees from the finest institutions in the country who would not hesitate to do whatever is in their hand to make sure their own children go to some of our finest institutions. So the whole time I'm thinking, okay, it is disingenuous, to be promoting that kind of argument, even to the point of, I guess it's Peter Thiel, he has this scholarship that convincing some high school students not to go to college because it's a waste of your time, and instead I'm going to give you a grant so you can set up a business. I'm like, by the way, he himself has not 1 but 2 degrees from Stanford. And my colleague has a degree from, I think, Berkeley and Princeton. In institutions like George Mason, 40% of our students are the first generation in their families to go to college. Their dream is to get a college degree, and that's a very rational decision. They know that the ability to connect with the middle class, to get a good job, to provide for their family is absolutely dependent on going to college and getting a degree. So for me, and questions about cost are real. Questions about value are not even contested by anybody. There's nobody actually showing any kind of data showing that it is not necessary to get a college degree. To me, the key question, and what I work on every single day, is actually how to remove barriers so that more people can get a college degree, not fewer people. And by the way, the work that community colleges are doing is essential in solving that puzzle.
Can I just double down on this? This is really important because at the height of the Great Recessions, the unemployment rate for people with bachelor's degrees never went above 4%. Okay, and so to say, right, that a college degree doesn't matter is extremely disingenuous, especially to our students, because we're dealing. 15% of our students are homeless. 65% experience food insecurity. A college degree is about survival and the ability to just be able to have some thriving opportunities in their lives, right? And so it's not theoretical, right? This is a very real thing that's going to inform the quality of their life and their family's life and for generations to come. And so we can't afford for that narrative to start creeping into any part of society, much less the parts of society, the lowest income communities in society. That just cannot happen.
Wouldn't it be nice if we were hearing the candidates right now talk about their plans for increasing the number of students who are college ready after high school and who actually matriculate either to a community college or a four-year university and are able to get a degree, to graduate, and to graduate with little or no debt. That to me is the plan, a value, a strategy that would really help so many in our country, right? To be able to really advance.
Yes.
So to me, the arguments we're hearing are kind of bass-ackwards. They're all about the debt. And we can unpack what's in that debt number, but to me, really what we ought to be doing is instilling that expectation that you will graduate from high school college ready, and there will be a college ready for you.
Yeah. Well,
I vote for you, by the way. That was perfect.
As you say, when Elizabeth Warren was speaking the other night, she got to that point where she talked about having gone to a commuter college in Oklahoma. And I forget what she paid at the time, so $95 or something like that, right? But those are community colleges, right? Those community colleges. And I was waiting for her to pivot, right? She never pivoted to what you're talking about. I was waiting for her to pivot because in my system, our full-time tuition, $1,752 for a full load. That's all in, tuition, fees. It also includes a transit card for you to get around Chicago so you can get to class, okay? Affordable option. You could take that and transfer to any four-year university you'd like. We have students going to Yale, we have students going to Northwestern, we have students going everywhere, okay? And so, this conversation about affordability and this trend of utilizing community colleges as a springboard to four-year universities is growing naturally already. These are partnerships that, all of higher ed are creating in accelerated ways, and yet candidates are not talking about this.
Right. It's like they have no idea. Right?
It's like they have no idea.
So 30% of the undergraduates at the University of California are transfer students from community college.
That's huge.
And they get that four-year degree, right? And we have plans and strategies to make the curricula at the community colleges even more integrated with what students need to be an upper division student at the UC so that they get the full value of that first 2 years in terms of credit hours. They really can start as a junior. That requires planning, it requires intentionality, but it also requires opening the door. I remember was it last year or 2 years ago, Princeton had this big splash that they were going to take transfer students. There were 13. You know, we had of our entering class this fall, almost 30,000 were transfer students. So, yeah.
So I want to bring us. I want to challenge this love fest a little bit here.
Good luck.
I'm an advocate for higher ed. I think another piece of data since the end of the recession, 95% of the jobs created require post-secondary education. Right? This is not a world in which you can make it without post-secondary, and yet some of the way we operate is part of the challenge. 80% of entering community college students say they want a bachelor's degree. 6 years later, 14% have one. GAO ran a study that showed that 40% of students are moving institutions during undergraduate degree. Right? 40% do not finish where they started. And they lose 43% of their credits when they move from one college to another. We've set up a system that where we, in some cases, are part of the challenge. And so I want to stick on this notion of student mobility and how students are operating and whether our institutions are ready for that, ready for, we've devised systems that are really designed for students who enter as freshmen and will finish at that institution, but in fact, that's not the reality. So each of you has decided to focus on transfer. Where are the biggest challenges with student mobility and with the way students exist today versus how our institutions are designed, particularly on this issue of mobility?
So I think one challenge is advising. It is making sure if a student thinks they may want to go on to a 4-year degree, having advisors that can help them see, well, what courses should they be taking at community college, what kind of GPA they may need to get, and then what kinds of 4-year colleges would be a good match for them. But I think really good advising, both in high school and at community colleges, has to be an essential part of this.
Yeah, I agree with you, Janet. I mean, here's the thing. When you're running a university, all the competitive forces, including, by the way, the almighty rankings that we all claim not to pay attention to, and we kind of do, they focus on your traditional student. By the way, the traditional student, which now for a number of years has become a minority of our students, is that student that graduates from high school, probably the children of most people in this room. Graduates from high school, goes full-time to a college, graduates in 4 years or soon thereafter. That's the 90% of the focus of most colleges. When I arrived to George Mason, all of our discussions with admissions had to deal with that. When you look at the numbers, it turns out half of our students, we're a 38,000 student university, half of our students come from community college. And most of them, by the way, from one community college, the Northern Virginia Community College. And there was absolutely no discussion, or almost no discussion, about that. So the main source of students by far for our university, and there was very little discussion about it. So we try to change that, and the former president of NOVA and I sort of got together and said, we need to accept the fact that the community college and George Mason, we are the system that serves Northern Virginia. We need to look at this in a systemic way. We took best practices on how to do transfer. This has all been investigated, in great part to that guy who's moderating us today, by the way. He and his center at Aspen Institute, they spent a lot of time looking at best practice and documenting how this thing is done. We should be interviewing you, by the way. So we took next panel. Next panel. So we took all that and we created a program called Advance, which includes advising. We brought faculty from the community college and from the university in one room. We didn't know if our faculty were going to be willing to play ball or not. Actually, 120 faculty from each side showed up. They rolled up their sleeves. They look at curriculum to make sure that if you want to be an accountant or a business major or a biology major, you knew exactly what courses to take in the community college, so you wouldn't find the surprise when you transferred that half of your credits didn't transfer, which happens to the vast majority of transfer students. You went to the community college to save money because you cannot afford 4 years of a regular university. And what you find out is that you wasted a semester or two, you wasted thousands of dollars. So we actually took the roadmap that Josh and others have been working on. We applied it, and it works. So congratulations.
Juan, so this is just a few students that are in community college in the United States, right?
Yeah.
This is not a big. So you've been trying to develop transfer pathways, as you mentioned. What are the real challenges here? Why has it been so broken for so long?
Yeah. I think there's new opportunity points, I'll say, right? So it's been broken for a long time because we haven't had a system of what I would call, guided pathways for students. So our students come in, and by the way, only 20% of our students are those traditional coming out of high school into college at our community college system. The overwhelmingly 80,000 students, overwhelmingly, they are students that have come through a different doorway. But for all of our students, it's really important that they develop a sense of where do I want to go and what do I want to do, right? And that's partially advising, but it's also course selection. So before we just had, here's a catalog, choose whatever you want. And they did, right? They're in college. Now we have something called guided pathways. You think you want to go into healthcare? Here's a series of courses. And this is how they transfer to the four-year university, right? And so you haven't made the ultimate decision of what your major is going to be, but you've narrowed your course selection some, right? In order to make wiser decisions, right? So that's one thing. But I think the other thing is we've got to take advising. We dropped our advising to student ratio. It used to be 1,000 students to 1. Okay? Well, you can't do much advising, right? We're now right around 400 to 1. It's not good enough. You know why? We got to get in the high schools, okay? Advising has to happen earlier, right? Not in the German tradition of having to make an ultimate choice, right? But to at least explore opportunities, right? So you have a better sense of what you want to do. And I think the last thing is we've got to move more towards sort of dual enrollment type programs where you're enrolling in community college, but you've sort of already made the selection of the 2 or 3 colleges you might want to go to. We actually have a partnership with Governor State University that's pure dual enrollment. You're enrolling with our college and Governor State at the very same time. They have a counselor on campus, right? That's wonderful. And then we have guided pathways to specific programs at the University of Illinois. That's another way of doing it. And then the last thing, by the way, is us going on to the four-year campus. So this fall, we're opening up the Harold Washington DePaul campus in Chicago. It's community college on a 4-year campus for the students that can get into DePaul but cannot afford a 4-year DePaul cost, right? And to their wisdom, they said, bring them on. We'll have your community college on our campus running at your cost, and these students will be dually enrolled. And so we've got to look at new models, I think, that are better for the student experience.
So when we talk about the value of college, we also often talk about, are you getting a degree? Are you actually completing college? But in fact, if you talk to students, even my kids who are going to these selective liberal arts colleges, and you ask why they're in college, they say, well, that's just sort of what you're supposed to do, right? And it's also true for students in community colleges that I speak with as I go around the country doing research. They'll say, I want a better life. My father was working, doing landscaping or construction, backbreaking work. I want a better life than he had, and I want to honor his investment in me, my parents' investment in me to have a better life. And so talk a little bit about the value of higher education in terms of connecting it to what comes next for students. How do you institutionally think about that? Are we as higher ed in your institutions doing enough to connect to the workforce? Is that in fact what we ought to be thinking about? When we think about value, what about the workforce connection, the better life that students can have afterwards? Is there any truth to that critique at all? How you raised this?
Yeah, no, I do think there's a critique. So in the traditional, in the pure liberal arts tradition in American higher ed, and I'm exaggerating only slightly, talking about career prospects was sort of beneath us. We educate the person. We want you to be enlightened, to be a citizen that contributes to a great society. Job stuff, not so much. Maybe later you can go to law school or business school or whatever. That's sort of maybe a little bit of a caricature of the traditional liberal arts model. We at Mason absolutely are shameless about declaring our intention of helping you get a good job. And when half of our students have to borrow money to pay for the thing, and many of them are graduating now with $20,000, $30,000 in debt, you'd better have a good answer to, by the way, this thing you're doing will help you get a good job. So we sit down with employers, and for example, we have a high demand in Northern Virginia in the field of cybersecurity. We wanted to start a bachelor's of engineering in cybersecurity. No one had done one before. We brought in the employers. Tell us what you think. Tell us what these people should know. We see no contradiction between helping you grow as a person and delivering on those very laudable and important values of the liberal arts model and helping you get a job. As a matter of fact, our argument is you are not a great citizen if you cannot do something productive in society. So from my perspective, we simply do not get the job done if we don't do both things. And I think, honestly, we should be perfectly comfortable saying that. The last thing that I'll mention is one example in which we're trying to align better. We have a group of CEOs and university leaders in the greater Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, very interested in improving the tech talent. And we have huge demand for computer science and related disciplines. As you know, Amazon chose to come to our neighborhood to set up their new headquarters, which really raises the demand for that type of individual. So we're now creating credentials so that you can major in history, if that's what you want, and still signal to employers that, by the way, I know how to hack code. I know how to use technology. I know how to analyze data. You can graduate with your bachelor's in history and have a digital credential that is blessed by and accepted by the leading employers in the region.
Thanks. Janet, thoughts?
Well, I think to follow up, I think there has been a false dichotomy in higher ed between educating the full person for to exercise their rights and duties as citizens, et cetera, in the post-Enlightenment tradition, and having competencies for the workforce. To me, we need to do both, and we need to integrate both. But we also have, I think, a role to play in thinking about the workforce of the future and the jobs of the future, which we may not even know what they are going to be. But I do think, as a country, we need to be thinking about, the workforce needs are going to be changing. That's going to be motivated by changes in technology. What are the generic skills that the next generation will need in order to navigate that?
I just say one of the things that would be helpful, what's happening in Chicago in the space of IT is business coming together, right? Oftentimes in higher education, we're all reaching out to business on our own. And to the degree that business can come together, it's helpful when a big company like Amazon comes in. But when you have lots of other smaller companies, there's an effort in Chicago called P33 that has brought together technologists in our city. And now at the table are our community college system, University of Illinois, and every other four-year university. And so we can operate as a system, right, to meet demand in the marketplace if the marketplace itself helps us to organize by organizing itself. So we're really encouraging, employers to get together. There's another effort we launched in Chicago, Apprenticeship 2020, where we're trying to create new opportunities for students to enter into non-traditional fields as apprentices coming out of community colleges. And what's made that effort successful is the employers driving that process and the employers engaging themselves in that process. And so I think we're going to need to see more of that if we're going to function, at an optimal moment.
So we're going to be having a deeper conversation about this with introduced by David Etzweiler from the Siemens Foundation at noon on campus for those who are pass holders. We're going to continue the conversation about the connection between workforce and higher ed. Questions from the audience?
Wow.
Lots of hands went up. Why don't we start in the back, since you've got the mic right there.
I'm Lauren Walters. I'm curious if you'd talk about how you, strategies to solve the retention problem, which you referred to, the drop-off from when students start to those that graduate. Of course, some do go to other schools, but just in an absolute sense, huge percentage, stunningly high percentage of students who start 2- and 4-year schools don't finish at all, just for everyone's benefit, 40 to 60%, depending on the data you look at. And those are the students that are both an opportunity and are sometimes lost from an employment perspective or an education perspective or putting a sound base.
Yeah, so I think one of the roles of advising is to show students what the actual graduation rates are of the colleges that they are considering. In terms of retention, I think you need to be focused on retention from the first day of freshman orientation. And it's a combination of making sure that we're providing good advising, that we use predictive analytics to identify students who may be at risk of dropping out so that we can intervene and provide additional academic services. It could be tutoring, it could be peer support, it could be any number of things. And then just to keep reinforcing the notion that you're there to get a degree, that the students entering in the fall of 2019 are the class of 2023, and kind of refer to them that way. Lastly, I think we need to be very cognizant of the living circumstances of our students while they are in college. If they are food insecure, if they are housing insecure, the idea of dropping out obviously rises. And so having the wherewithal to, again, provide support for those students who find themselves in that situation, I think very important.
Any other? So let me just add two things that the research seems to be suggesting now. One is that if you can connect students early to a sense of purpose, Chancellor Salgado, Juan mentioned the work being done on guided pathways. There's good evidence that once students take 9 credits in their program of study, they're much more likely to graduate. And so there's been a lot of work to connect students to purpose early on. There's a tension between that and this notion of wandering through a curriculum and finding yourself. And so people talk about curating opportunities so students get connection early. That's one. The second is, for a long time, we've known that there are certain high-impact practices in that first semester, in that first year. And in fact, they don't just help students be retained, but they seem to be connected with happiness in life and work after they graduate. So there are things like long-term projects, a strong relationship with a single professor that are developed. These are the kinds of things that seem to both help with retention, graduation, and in fact longer-term life success. So two research-based, in addition to what Janet mentioned, I think those are ways that a lot of colleges are now thinking about moving to higher rates of retention and graduation. Yes, in the back.
I just submit that you're all in the sweet spot, being public institutions, most of your students being local or in-state. Could one of you take on the case for a private institution, not for profit, where tuition runs $65,000 a year plus room and board, so dues are kind of $85,000 a year, perhaps outside of the Ivy Plus?
Anybody want
You
to
mean
defend $70,000?
to make the case that you ought to consider that for your children, or I'll let Janet take on that.
I'm not taking it on.
No, listen, as I said earlier, the higher ed ecosystem in the United States is comprised of many different kinds of institutions. It's why so many students from around the world want to come to the United States for their college educations. And, we have lots of very high quality private institutions. Their costs are higher. As you noted, tuition is higher. Many of those kinds of schools are finding themselves discounting tuition to a large degree in order so that they can sustain enrollment, so they can survive. They are going to have to use a variety of techniques in order to survive. But these are many of them wonderful, wonderful institutions in the United States.
I'll take a stab at it. As a graduate of Vassar College, I'm sending my two boys to small liberal arts colleges. In addition to community colleges, liberal arts colleges have small classrooms. There is very strong evidence that students in STEM fields are more likely to succeed in some ways than some of the public universities with larger classes and graduate schools teaching. And so, the question of affordability is enormous. But in terms of value, small liberal arts colleges have, I think, been demonstrated time and time again to yield good results. In terms of the cost, look, only 8% of American families, 7% now, can afford these institutions at $70,000 a year. That's why a lot of them are discounting. We have something called the American Talent Initiative that we co-run with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Ithaca S&R. We're 120 highly selective institutions, including Mason, Georgia Tech, and all of the UC campuses have agreed to set targets for socioeconomic diversity. So one of the ideas is you've got to provide financial aid and you've got to set targets to let lower income students in and moderate income students in who can't afford to go to these places. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. In fact, we have exceptions here to that rule on the stage, but in a lot of colleges, of the top colleges, they aren't letting in lower income students and aren't paying for them. But we have great counterexamples of where tuition is being discounted for lots of students at Franklin and Marshall, Vassar College, Princeton is now doing terrific work on that front, in addition to all of the UC schools and George Mason. So I think justifying the full freight cost is difficult, and very few can afford it. The question for these colleges is how do they become engines of opportunity and not bastions of privilege, where only 8% of Americans can afford to go. Yes, here in the front.
But that's not really the question as to afford it. I mean, that is an important point. But structurally, you have a university that structurally costs $60,000 to go. I don't care who's paying for it. Mm-hmm. You have a university that costs $1,700. What we haven't talked about is technology and online learning and the impact of that. Can a Harvard or a Princeton or even a Georgia Tech sustain in the future these increases in costs when the ability to online learn. Heck, my friend here says his wife is doing an online course at University of Houston, and she's up in New Hampshire taking this class. You know, is that a viable alternative?
It must be, for two reasons. One is, back to the question of retention, there are about 45 million people in this country, 45 million, some estimates even higher, who took some classes in college and dropped out, never finished their degree. That's really the bulk of where the opportunity is. You want to have a better educated country, more competitive country, more productive country, focus on those 45 million people. The only way to serve those 45 million people is through online. Those are the folks, and they're members of your families or neighbors, and these are folks who now have families and jobs, and they just cannot pack up and say, I'm going to go full-time to Berkeley or to Atlanta, and I'm going to go and finish my degree. That's not an option. Either it's online or you're not going to get your degree. So there is that part of why it's essential that we continue to expand online options. The cost is another one. Now, until now, by the way, online has nothing magic about cost. If you replicate what you do in a normal classroom, expensive faculty member, let's say 50 students pay, and you just put it online, you haven't changed the economics at all. Now, there are new forms of online that are dramatically changing that equation. By the way, my new employer, Georgia Tech, just started a couple of years ago an online master's in computer science. This is the first time they did it. They were going to do it at a fraction of the tuition as the full-time residential program. People didn't know if this thing was going to work. Is right now the largest master's in computer science in the world. I mean, 10,000.
$6,000 or $7,000 for the degree? For
the degree, and there are about 10,000 people are doing. So there are ways in which online may be able to reduce the it's not automatic, but it can happen.
Let me make a point about online because, first of all, it is an essential part of higher ed today. Where I see it providing lots of additional value is what Angel said, the master's degree. Online master's degrees, I think, are multiplying. And and they're many of them are extremely successful, and they're very good. With respect to the undergraduate curricula, I would hesitate to move into the world about totally online bachelor's degrees. And the reason I say that is because I think there's value in students being physically with other students in a class. There's a socialization and a social maturation aspect to college. And I think in terms of retention, I think doing a fully online bachelor's degree for your typical 18 or 19-year-old, I'm just not sure that that's going to be successful.
One from the community college
But
perspective?
we do have universities. SIU Carbondale has now moved on to one of our campuses to provide an online degree so that you'll never have to leave the community college campus to get your bachelor's degree. And as these are opportunity points. I still a lot more of this kind of partnership actually happening to complete the degree. You see this in nursing quite a bit. We get folks to the associate's degree, and then there are lots of online providers that are providing a one-year bachelor's degree in nursing.
Great. The woman in the front here. Yes. Yes, you and then the woman next to you as well. About that. Why don't we take two questions and.
Okay. I have only 82 questions, so stay put. I have a child who just graduated high school, and we spent the last year and a half looking at colleges across the country, and I have to say, I want to go back to college. I can't believe the amount of dynamic, exciting things that I have seen on campuses across the country, all different types of schools. Is it just am I missing something? But are more students applying to college than ever before? I feel like it's more competitive. I feel like as much as we're talking about college debt, I think that it's not keeping people from, you guys must have an overwhelming amount of applications at your universities. Am I missing something?
You're right. So you're right on both counts. A is that if I could right now, I would be a college student. I mean, it is absolutely awesome. And pretty much any college that you choose, I mean, the number of services, the experiences, the intensity of that is absolutely wonderful. Interestingly, the demographics of high school graduates have actually plateaued and are now declining. So expect discounts even on the expensive private schools because they're having a harder time filling their rooms. So, but
the cliff is coming in 2025. Unfortunate for you.
But you're absolutely right that there seems to be a tendency of sort of like a group of universities are driving more and more applications. So the selective are becoming even more selective, and the sort of middle of the pack sort of public schools that are not maybe the flagship, those are the ones that are having, those and many of the privates are having a hard time getting enough applications. But there is a dynamic where people seem to be applying to the very same school. So yeah, it is not, you're not making it up, it is actually a thing. I mean, that's the trend.
Yeah, the baby boom echo is now, and but the cliff is coming. People stopped having children at the beginning of the recession. People aren't dumb, right? I lose my job, I lose my house, I'm not having kids, and the baby boom echo is ending. And so there is a cliff coming, and it's about 2025, and all of the systems in higher ed have been built in these days of rapid increase because we expanded access through Pell Grants and GI Bill and other things. And so we've had this really decades of expansion, and now we're going to see a decline, and I think it's really a question for colleges and universities throughout the country as to how they're going to respond. But for you and me, who are looking at this the worst time, it didn't help us at all. I'm seeing a red flashing light. How are we doing on time? Are we at time? 0. We're at 0. I was told. I mentioned. Can we take one more question? Would that be okay? I mentioned to the woman in front that we would take your question. And don't want to be a liar.
One of the things that I've been looking for in this discussion is not simply a subjective look at would this college be worth it economically to me, to my family, but what are the colleges doing that hold their worth in our society, in a democracy?
Wow. Can we start the session again? Because that is a wonderful question. So I'll just give you 2 pieces of data. One is, and we do this the analysis every year. The concentration of world-class universities that are rated in the top 200 or 300 in the world, including the UC systems and both my schools now, the concentration correlates at about a 90% with competitiveness of a country. So the existence, the presence of of very competitive research universities actually drives innovation and drives economic success, and increasingly so. So that's one thing. The other thing is when you look at the data of higher education participation rates in across nations, the higher ed participation, the more citizens in a country go to school, the better off that country is. Every time I hear about are we educating too much, it's nonsense. No society in the history of the world has ever been found that failed for educating more people. So when you're thinking about in terms of policy and limited budgets, really, and this is admittedly self-serving, but actually backed with data, one of the absolute best investments you can make is in education.
Any other final thoughts on that?
I'll just say we have something in the United States of America called the American dream. It's about upward mobility. And I think that one of the things that Raj Chetty has been doing, was at Stanford, now at Harvard, is looking at mobility as an important metric for colleges, and particularly community colleges. Our system ranked top 10% as a mobility college, right? The ability to move people from the lowest quintiles up 2 quintiles, even all the way from the bottom to the top, right? That ought to be something we value. I think there's a correlation there between mobility and a strong democracy, right? So that's something I keep my eye on.
Janet, last word.
Yeah, so I'll just close by saying, and there's another role that particularly research universities play, and that is helping really think through some of the big challenges that our society is facing. So, for example, global warming, existential threat. The University of California has set a goal of itself being carbon neutral by 2025. That's a very aggressive goal, but there's a lot of activity and research underway to help us meet that goal, all of which can be shared with the local communities in which our campuses are located, as well as nationally. A second issue that we have been dealing with is the issue of free speech on college campuses. And we actually established a center in Washington, D.C. to study the issue of free speech on college campuses, to kind of unpack all of the questions that arise in that arena. So in addition to all of the things that have been said in the panel, we shouldn't forget that universities themselves can help us with our grand challenges.
So thank you. There's a great hopeful note to end on. If you'd like to learn more about Aspen's higher ed work, the College Excellence Program, we have 30 staff and 8 or 10 projects, some of the things that we've talked about here today. Please join me in thanking this great panel.